In 1492, there wasn't a single cow in North America. Today, the US has about 95 million cattle, worth over $100 billion. This is the wild, untold story of how cattle got to America. The cattle industry built the American West. It created cowboys, shaped our economy, and gave us everything from steakhouses to rodeos. But here's what most people don't know. Nearly every cow in America today traces its roots back to a handful of animals that crossed the Atlantic Ocean over 500 years ago. Christopher Columbus brought the first cattle to the Americas on his second voyage in 1493. But they didn't land in what would become the United States. They went to the Caribbean islands, like Hispaniola. The real game changer came in 1521, when Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés invaded Mexico. He didn't just bring soldiers and priests. He brought livestock specifically. Hardy Spanish cattle that would evolve into the longhorn breed, tough enough to survive the brutal journey across the Atlantic. These weren't your modern dairy cows. Spanish longhorns were lean, aggressive, and could survive on scrubland that would kill more pampered European breeds. They had horns that could span up to 6 feet across, and they could go days without water. Within 50 years, these cattle had exploded across Mexico. The Spanish missions and settlements needed them for food, leather, and tallow. But more importantly, the cattle thrived in a way they never did in Europe. No major natural predators, endless grasslands, and a climate similar to their Mediterranean homeland. By 1600, there were an estimated 150,000 head of cattle in northern Mexico, just south of what would become Texas. The Spanish pushed north into what's now the American Southwest, establishing missions in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And wherever the missions went, the cattle followed. Mission San Antonio de Valero, better known today as the Alamo, was founded in 1718. It started with just 20 head of cattle. Within 30 years, the mission herds had grown to thousands. Here's where it gets interesting. The Spanish had strict laws about who could own cattle, limiting it mostly to colonists and missions. But enforcing those laws on the remote frontier was nearly impossible. Cattle wandered, escaped, and went feral. Native American tribes, particularly the Comanche and Apache, began raiding Spanish settlements and adopting cattle into their own economies, using them for food, trade, and hides. By the time Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821, there were already hundreds of thousands of semi-wild longhorns roaming Texas. These weren't owned by anyone. They were just there, waiting. When American settlers started moving into Mexican Texas in the 1820s, they found a rancher's paradise. Vast open land and free roaming cattle ready to be claimed. After Texas gained independence in 1836, and especially after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, that's when the U.S. acquired much of the Southwest. American ranchers realized they were sitting on a gold mine. There were millions of free-ranging longhorns in Texas, worth maybe $3 to $4 per head locally. But in the industrial North and East Coast cities, beef was selling for 10 times that amount. The problem? Transportation. There were no railroads connecting Texas to the north yet. So, ranchers did something bold. They walked the cattle there on massive drives. The first major cattle drive happened in 1846, when Edward Piper drove 1,000 head from Texas to Ohio, a journey of over 1,200 miles. That took months. But the real boom started after the Civil War in 1866, as demand for beef surged in the growing urban centers. Between 1866 and 1890, cowboys drove an estimated 10 million cattle north from Texas along famous trails like the Chisholm Trail and Goodnight Loving Trail. They headed to railroad towns in Kansas Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita, where the cattle were loaded onto trains and shipped to Chicago's massive stockyards for processing and distribution. This is where the American cowboy was born. And here's a fact Hollywood often got wrong. About 1 in 4 cowboys was black, many freed after the Civil War, and many others were Mexican vaqueros who taught Americans the skills of roping and herding. This wasn't the all-white story you see in old westerns. Those tough Spanish longhorns built the industry, but they had a drawback. They were too lean and stringy for American tastes, which favored fatter, more marbled beef. Starting in the 1870s, ranchers began importing British cattle breeds, Herefords, Angus, and Shorthorns. These had been refined over centuries for superior meat production. Ranchers crossbred them with longhorns, creating hardier hybrids that combine toughness with better beef quality, the foundation of the cattle we know today. The invention of barbed wire in 1874 changed everything. The open range disappeared, as ranchers could now fence their land, control breeding, and manage herds, preventing overgrazing and mixing. By 1900, the era of the great cattle drives was over. Railroads crisscrossed the West, making long overland treks unnecessary. Ranching became a structured industry, not a frontier adventure. Today, the U.S. cattle industry is worth over $100 billion annually. We have approximately 95 million head of cattle, making us the fourth largest cattle population in the world after India, Brazil, and China. But here's the surprising part. Despite having 95 million cattle today, there were actually more cattle per capita in 1900 than there are now, thanks to a smaller human population back then. We've just gotten far more efficient at raising them. Modern breeds, like Black Angus, dominate the market. A single bull's genetics can be used to sire thousands of calves through artificial insemination. We've optimized everything from feed conversion ratios to growth rates, using science and technology. The average steer today reaches market weight in 18 to 22 months. In the 1800s, it took 4 to 5 years. We produce more beef with fewer cattle than ever before, through better nutrition, veterinary care, and selective breeding. So from 0 cattle in North America in 1492 to 95 million today, the American cattle industry is a story of Spanish conquest, frontier expansion, cowboy grit, and industrial innovation. Those first few dozen cattle that crossed the Atlantic with Columbus and the conquistadors multiplied into an industry that shaped our culture, our economy, and our dinner plates. Every hamburger, every steak, every leather belt traces its origins back to those hardy Spanish longhorns that spread north from Mexico over 500 years ago.